It's Sunday, September 1, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minute news. We're thrilled to welcome back Dr Bandy Lee, forensic and social psychiatrist, a world expert on violence, who became known to the public as the editor of the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. After the corporate media chose to silence her findings, we decided to give her a platform. Dr. Lee, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Thank you for having me back.
There has been a huge response to your analysis on this program over the last couple of weeks, and it is a true honor to kind of dig into the weeds of Donald Trump with you. Each week he gives us no shortage of material to work with, and he on Thursday was in Michigan, and maybe we can start there. Incidentally, I want to come on, if possible, a little bit later to talk a bit about his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, because I think he's a very interesting kind of diversion and character as well. But let's just start in Michigan. And we're going to start outside of the rally, because Donald Trump chose a very small town, Potterville, to have his rally on Thursday. In fact, there are only 3,082 people living in Potterville, Michigan, and yet he decided to have a rally there. The local news service filmed his car arriving, obviously, with all the security and everything, and there was a handful of people there. A handful. If the whole town came out, that's great, but it was still just a few people, and the same inside. And yet, Donald Trump started his rally by saying that there were thousands and thousands of people lining the streets as he was arriving, thousands of people that couldn't get into the rally, and they were queuing outside, and completely lying about the level of support that he has. Now, we know he's obsessed with crowd size, but when the evidence is so clear, courtesy of local news reporting, what does that say about him as we lead into these final 2 months towards the election, and when Kamala Harris's star and crowds are rising?
Well, as you know, he has been nearly obsessed with crowd size to the point where he was initially lying about Kamala Harris's crowd sizes, that she was inflating them, that she was using artificial intelligence to create crowds where none existed. Well, he's essentially giving away his worldview that one could create any kind of reality. When the reality becomes too unbearable for someone like himself, who has exhibited a great deal of mental fragility and instability, the fact that these enormous crowds are gathering for Kamala Harris in ways that they are no longer for him. He's done rallies in the same stadiums where the same kind of crowds did not gather for him. So we can conjecture that he is choosing these small town settings where there could be no comparison, where he can essentially invent his own reality that would make things more tolerable for him. When you are detached from reality, you can essentially create any kind of fantasy, wishful world you wish to create. And that's what this kind of campaigning signals to me, that he's removing himself almost entirely from the campaigning that he used to do that would draw a comparison with Harris.
That's so interesting, because last week he was choosing safe districts to campaign in. Where is that because, he needs to know that he's got a guaranteed audience? I mean, there's no point in campaigning in places where you're an outright winner anyway. Just talk to that.
Yes, he needs emotionally the affirmation, adulation, and adoration that the crowds provide for him. And it's a greater need than perhaps any of us can truly grasp, because most of us, those who are emotionally healthy and well supplied, do not need that kind of affirmation, constant affirmation from the outside that for him would feel as if his psychic survival were at stake if he did not have.
It reminds me of that weird first cabinet meeting that he held in front of the cameras, where he assembled all of his presidential candidate cabinet and insisted that they went round the room celebrating him and saying why they love their president and how thrilled they are to have the job. That was one of certainly the earliest red flags once he was in office, that we weren't dealing with a healthy-minded person.
That's right. And what an unhealthy person least wishes to hear is that his health is compromised and that he's not mentally up for the job. So that's why his fitness has been so difficult to discuss, and how the media decided to simply pretend that that area does not exist. But of course, denying the problem doesn't make the problem go away, just like the COVID pandemic doesn't go away just because we ignore it. And so his symptoms and structure of thinking has spread in a way that a good third, if not up to half of voters, are now adopting his way of thinking. So that's really the public health concern that we've been speaking about since the very beginning. Because when we first decided to speak up about Donald Trump as mental health experts, it was not to treat him as a patient, certainly, and not to focus on his individual mental health, but to focus on the effects he would have on the public's mental health.
That's something I want to focus on today. And a lot of people have been writing to me this last week about this specifically, about how he can, by nature of his own insanity, cause other people to catch it. Do people, i.e. his supporters, do they need to be mentally ill before they come into contact with Donald Trump? Or do they just have to be vulnerable to his charms?
Yes, there are many categories, and it's been studied for the last 150 years, even though nowadays we tend to think of mental health as being only individually confined. But actually, all mental symptoms are psychosocial. And it's been studied for quite some time that mental symptoms are indeed contagious. That's what I tried to emphasize and write about in my latest book, The Psychology of Trump Contagion, that much of what we're seeing now that's puzzling, that's been a conundrum for pretty much all the pundits who are not mental health professionals, has been that what we're looking at is what we normally see in well, for myself, I've seen it in public sector settings where individuals can go for long periods of time with severe symptoms without treatment. So in prisons and state hospital settings, I've seen this a great deal. We don't think of mental symptoms as being contagious, but in fact, they may be even more so, because you don't need physical exposure for the symptoms to spread. You just need emotional bonds. So more so than whether or not someone is mentally ill to start, it would be those emotional bonds, as well as a facilitating environment, such as propaganda networks or cultic programming, as I've come to call it, when the so-called news networks are not just spreading disinformation, but they're actually following the symptoms, and they're following the lead of Donald Trump, in other words, because the spread of his symptoms have been so dramatic that profit follows along more than any other method. So that what we do not realize is that the emotional compulsion behind mental symptoms will be much more powerful than say, rational persuasion, facts, evidence, or even logical self-interest. So it can become very influential, pernicious, and ultimately destructive for the environment where the symptoms are spread, because ultimately it's the spread of pathology.
It's very sad to watch it in real time, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about so many people, and it's hard to qualify or quantify the true number of people out of, say, the 70 million people that voted for him in 2020. Of that number, how many of those are just people who have historically voted Republican and just can't vote any other way, can't bring themselves to do it? Or people that are genuinely bought into the lie that Donald Trump is a great business mind and an entrepreneur and a great success, rather than just being an actor. Because that's the way I see him. I see him being cast on The Apprentice. His star was not bright before he got that job. There'd been multiple business bankruptcies and various financial issues, and that's really what lit him up. And so people bought into that. Is that a kind of uniquely American thing, where it's like the guy off the telly is good enough for us?
I think the media have to do a lot with it. The structure of our media, and especially now social media, are set up so that more so than positive emotions, negative emotions spread more quickly. Symptoms spread more quickly than healthy messages. And ultimately, it becomes a conduit for things going viral in ways that are more destructive than helpful. If there's exposure of this kind of pathology. And indeed, it's been very difficult to observe because this is very well known to the mental health profession. It's quite obvious to us that it's predictable and preventable in terms of its spread and damage it does. And the further it spreads, it looks like success, but ultimately everyone loses, because even the individual who is driven to do this, Donald Trump, in other words, is going to be self-destructive. And we're allowing him to bring down his followers and the country with him.
That's the saddest part of the story, though, isn't it? That the whole thing will not have been worth it. The whole division of the nation, causing people to be sucked into this cult where they spend their hard-earned money on merchandise and his events and donating to his campaign, paying his legal fees. It will not have been worth it, because the cost, not just to them, but to the nation, is the fall of US democracy, the rise of fascism and Christian nationalism and political extremism and violence. And yet he didn't promise them anything in terms of policies that would actually benefit them as individuals. I mean, I think no tax on tips might be the first thing he's ever said that might actually be of value to these people that support him.
That's right. He dehumanizes them. He disdains them to the point of not caring that he's usurping their personalities, their personal lives, their whatever little they have amassed through hard-earned living, as you described. They're buying all kinds of paraphernalia. He's constantly advertising things that they should buy to make themselves feel better, to help him feel better. And he's creating instruments for his own needs out of people. And he cannot see other people as human beings because his personal needs are so great and he is so absorbed in himself that he cannot think of other people as as equal human beings. And that's why a democracy is not possible for such an individual.
He lets it slip sometimes, doesn't he? A few months ago when he said, I don't care about you. I just need your votes. I don't care about you. And that was a very telling moment. And I'm really surprised that that hasn't been played on a loop. It's certainly on a loop in my head, because that's who he really is. He actually says these things behind the scenes. We know that he has a real potty mouth behind the scenes, and the language that he uses when he's in personal company is so offensive, and he uses the N-word to describe black people. He really is the lowest of the low, and yet puts on this show that sometimes the veil does come down.
Oh, yes, he's constantly expressing himself and giving away his thinking. If we know how to detect what he's really saying, or even when he's projecting onto other people, usually those with severe symptoms cannot tolerate having those symptoms, and therefore they project them onto other people, especially their opponents, in order to deny those attributes and to disown them. And so if we know how to interpret what he's saying, he's actually giving away his thought structure constantly. And it's a very frightening and impaired thought structure.
And what is the difference between those of us that can understand or translate the true language of Trump, i.e. take those projections and flip them, and, you know, it's not even that difficult, but there are those who will literally take every word as gospel. He's relying on those people, isn't he?
Exactly. It depends on our maintaining our own mental health, practicing good mental hygiene, and not denying the fact that there are impairments in our mental health that we need to address, and not giving into defenses. In other words, when we feel powerless, we might wish to project omnipotence and genius in order to make up for the intolerable feelings of helplessness, or
so it's not intellect or intelligence. It's more an emotional void that allows him in.
That's right. And those are the first people he will touch and connect with, because he seeks out vulnerable individuals in the population. And that's how it first begins. In fact, I've called it narcissistic symbiosis, in that developmentally wounded individuals will be attracted to a similarly developmentally wounded leader. And narcissism is a form of developmental wounds arrestation, to the point where one remains at an earlier stage of development looking for a parental figure who will take charge and protect them and take care of things for them, rather than treat them like an equal human being. Those who are still at the stage where they're looking for a parent figure will not wish to have autonomy, self-reliance, and democracy, because they're actually looking for a strong figure who would end up not being the true strong figure, because anyone who would project themselves as such is actually deceiving the public. That's why strongman figures are actually weak men who are trying to resolve their own deficiencies through public adulation, when in fact they have nothing really to give other than a fantasy.
This is why we hear about the ketchup on the walls story, right? Because he has a temper, he gets angry, he throws things. He's somebody whose frustration, it must be very hard to live like that. You know, this is why I'm surprised that he's still alive, considering that, you know, his physicality and his diet and the stresses that he must carry. Do you think that this period especially is stressful for him? Or as a narcissist, it doesn't really kind of affect him as it might affect the rest of us?
Oh, I think absolutely. He is suffering beyond measure. What we often don't emphasize is just how much one suffers when one is afflicted with mental symptoms. In fact, that could be defined as the difference between mental health and unhealth, in that one feels pain and suffering, but because one is impaired, the way one seeks resolution of that suffering is often not through valid treatment and seeking actual helpful guidance, but dysfunctional solutions, such as going for the office of the presidency when Donald Trump has been found to be quite deficient, and in fact, on our panel's examination, to be unfit for any job. And so his way of denying that reality, which he knows deep inside, which is why he has to go around and boast about the one cognitive screen, 10-minute cognitive screen that he did that simply rules him out from having to be in a nursing home, as proving that he's a genius, and challenging Joe Biden, challenging everyone to take the same, because he is so hungry for that kind of affirmation, knowing that he lacks it inside.
So he knows that he is deficient, which is why he often says, "I'm like a very smart guy, the stable genius," and then refers to his uncle being a professor at MIT, and because of them sharing genes, that must make him smart too. I mean, that's a stretch for anybody, isn't it? And yet for him, it's perfectly a normal and acceptable thing to say.
Well, he'll grasp at anything because he's desperate. He's like I often compare it to a drowning man. His psychic need is so urgent. His inner resources are so few that he must grasp at anything and make himself publicly known as the opposite of who he is. But for those of us who don't share his needs, and those of us who have some level of mental health education, will be able to recognize what this is. Most people did not recognize what this was when he first came onto the scene, which was why we as mental health professionals felt it was urgent to educate the public. In fact, mental health education is one of the greatest interventions we can do at a public health level to prevent this kind of spread of symptoms. I've called fascism mental pathology in politics because it is a phenomenon of spread of symptoms. When someone who is severely mentally impaired gets into an influential office with a lot of exposure to the public, the symptoms then spread. And part of the conduit is mass media, but we now also have social media. And so the spread has been more rapid. And that is what we're seeing when someone who has caused more than 1 million American deaths from mismanagement of the COVID pandemic, someone who has caused a violent insurrection against the government, someone who has upended the world order to the point where we have so many conflicts and far fewer collaborative alliances than before him. And he invited and instituted violence as valid means for doing politics. And yet he is still neck and neck with Kamala Harris.
It's
How does that happen?
Yeah, remarkable.
There's no other explanation.
There's just, I mean, you know, some of us take the polling with a pinch of salt, but currently he's polling about 2 points behind her. We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about his election strategy, claiming that America is a failing nation. and how that's going to work out for him. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. We often think living a more heart-healthy life means making big, unsustainable changes. Well, with SuperBeets Heart Chews, you can get daily blood pressure support in just 2 tasty chews a day. And they even promote heart-healthy energy without the stimulants. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the antioxidants in SuperBeets are clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. Heart health is very important to me. I'd like to live as long as possible to enjoy my kids in old age. Effective and clinically studied from SuperBeets, the #1 doctor, pharmacist and cardiologist recommended beet brand for cardiovascular health support. Double your potential with SuperBeets Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of SuperBeets Heart Chews on all bundles and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeets.com and using code WEEKEND. That's getsuperbeets.com. Code WEEKEND. We're back on The Weekend Show with Dr. Bandy Lee. I'm Anthony Davis. So Donald Trump's strategy, it seems, and I've heard this at every rally, is to claim that America is a nation in decline. We are a failing nation. We are a laughingstock. All of this stuff, which, again, does not equate to reality. I mean, we certainly were a laughingstock when he was in office, and we have the video evidence of that at the United Nations when he said, you know, I've done more than any president in history, and everybody, all the dignitaries and heads of state started laughing, and he was like, I wasn't expecting that reaction. So there's that, but there's also the fact that inflation is coming down, the jobs numbers are better, the stock market is doing really well. Donald Trump's stock, incidentally, is through the floor. And so people's experience of the United States is not one of a nation in decline. In fact, we've grown more than any other nation out the back of the pandemic, and are still the largest economy on the planet. So how does he qualify that? And what does that mean to his supporters when they hear him say that? What's he talking to? And is he going to get away with it?
Well, this is said to be the great era where we are the envy of the world when it comes to our economy, and we're doing better than any period since the 1960s, many have said. And yet, the reality is not influencing people's perception. And this mismatch is almost unprecedented. Well, the appearance of someone as mentally impaired as Donald Trump is unprecedented. That's the varying factor. Will this succeed? His method, by the way, is a good indication of his state of mind. He finds himself to be failing. He finds himself to be in ruins, devastated, and in decline. He feels that he's the laughing stock of the world, and he notices that far before anyone, which is why he can't even bring it into his consciousness. We actually think of our minds as being we think of our conscious minds as being the whole of our minds. Sigmund Freud said the mind is like an iceberg with 6/7 underwater. Well, now we know from neuroscientific studies that it's far more than that. It's about 98% underwater, meaning there's a lot going on there than we're aware of.
That's so interesting that he knows that he's a laughingstock, and that the nation in decline, it turns out, courtesy of your analysis, is a metaphor for Donald Trump is in decline.
Exactly. Well put.
It's kind of mind-blowing, though, really, isn't it? Because it's pretty simple. When it's explained, it's pretty simple.
Exactly.
And that's why I suppose it we hope that people will start to kind of pick up, as courtesy of your explanations, people will start to pick up on the fact that, anything that happens, because I presume that all these legal cases against him are also weighing on him enormously. And so that, again, is why he sees the nation in decline, because it is not allowing him to get away with the crimes that he's always committed.
Exactly. And his expectations have been allowed to balloon, but they're far from being met. His wishful fantasies will never become reality. And that's devastating for him. And to face the reality of going to prison if he were not to be elected, the stakes are far greater for him than even the 2020 election, whereas his expectations have exponentially grown, especially when the courts have taken his side for the most part, when even the Supreme Court gave him immunity. So after all this, how can he adapt back to reality? It's going to be a great challenge. And that's why giving unfit individuals what they're asking for, giving them power, is the last thing you wish to do. They don't remain neutral. They not only abuse it, they bring on catastrophic consequences for their having the power.
I want to talk about the people, and I'm mainly speaking about Trump supporters who I see interviewed. And there is a consistent message that they feel, and that is that things were more affordable when Donald Trump was president, and that gas was not so high, and that groceries were not so expensive. This is something that he really is pushing. Now, if you look at the actual data, we need to be clear that inflation is a worldwide issue that was born of the pandemic, supply chain issues, and also, as we've discovered this week with Kroger, who have been hit because it turns out they've been price gouging, taking advantage of the pandemic, and these corporate companies who are not regulated are seeing excessive profits and taking advantage of the public, using the excuse of supply chain and pandemic, when in fact they are just making a killing, literally rinsing the public.
Right.
So how do we deal with the supporters of Trump who would vote for him because they think that when he was president, their life was more affordable?
Well, his method, his manipulation and deception of the public is by appropriating things that he did not achieve and changing people's perceptions so that they will see things in the opposite of reality. But this has actually been a wider phenomenon. My colleagues and I have studied violent death rates over time, and party of the presidency as an environmental factor that could influence death rates. And we have found, astonishingly, it was actually quite a surprise to me. It wasn't originally my idea, but my senior colleague, James Gilligan's, who is a renowned violence scholar. And he had noticed that violent death rates were going up and down according to presidencies. And so we actually did a very rigorous statistical study over 110 years of American history from 1900 to 1910. And we found that every time, without exception, except for one each, whenever there was a Republican president, the violent death rates would double. And whenever there was a Democratic president, the violent death rates would halve. So over time, this, because the parties tend to alternate, it looks like things are random or constant. But in fact, if we stack the party presidencies together, all the Democrats together and all the Republicans together, the death rates would simply go up in a straight line with Republican presidencies, whereas they would decrease in a straight line with Democratic presidencies. Now, that's while controlling for all economic policies and unemployment rates, GDP. So it was purely party effect. But we also see that with the economy. We think of Republicans because they tout their their
conservatism,
they allow for economic growth, that they would be good for the economy. But in fact, the opposite is found, that every time there's a Republican president, that our GDP tends to go down. And whenever there's a Democratic president, it goes up, and all the recessions and depressions have been confined to Republican presidencies. So how does it happen that they're able to own the opposite narrative? This too is, we can see some of the mental health or the psychological denial effects come into play. The need to project themselves as the party of security, the party of prosperity, because they are causing so much damage. And Donald Trump can be seen as the exaggeration of that trend, the culmination of what the Republican Party had been doing. So, and also there's a 2-year time lag, I should mention. Right. Because of the 2-year time lag and because of the alternation of parties, we don't see the effects until 2 years later. So Donald Trump has owned a great deal of what the Obama administration had accomplished, whereas he had handed over to Joe Biden a lot of the consequences of poor policies.
Yes, we've seen that in the graph. The growth graph really didn't change when Donald Trump took office. It was on a steady climb, and there was no kind of spike, which suggests that Donald Trump really didn't do anything to change that. He inherited a growing economy, which happened in Obama's second term. And then it's a little bit like, maybe we should use gas prices as an example. You know, Donald Trump has selective memory when it comes to numbers. I'm convinced he has like a magic number machine in his head that's a randomizer. You know, he just like presses the button and it just pings up a number, and that's the number that he will say in that moment. Because if you analyze the data, every time he speaks, the number is different. And with gas prices, he claims that, you know, gas prices were $7, $8, $9 a gallon before, and now, you know, under him, that they were $2 and $3, and now they're $7, $8, and $9. Neither of those markers are true. And there are caveats to that, which is such as in California, gas is more expensive because it has to be a different recipe to meet emissions targets. But that aside, he loves to use these numbers, which if his supporters are paying attention, they'll discover that the numbers are entirely inconsistent.
Well, what he asserts has nothing to do with reality. In other words, it's not the numbers that matter or the real facts, but the fact that they feel true to him, and he'll convey that feeling of truth. And that's part of how he actually spreads his symptoms. Even delusions would be spread this way.
Let's talk for a moment about J.D. Vance, because he has been, obviously prior to this sudden rise to the vice presidential candidate role, he has had multiple jobs. He's, you know, worked in finance. He wrote a book which became a Netflix movie, various things. But what he has kind of forgotten about are all the podcasts that he went on over the years where he has really spoken as his true self. And so now there are leaks coming out, or certainly people finding these podcasts where, and I'll just quote, he said that professional women choose a path to misery when they prioritize careers over having children. He said this in a podcast in September 2021. He also claimed men in America were suppressed in their masculinity. And, he's also talked about teachers, and how teachers who don't have, I think he criticized teachers for not having their own children, and referring to childless cat ladies. And he seems to be obsessed with the family as a unit, except to the detriment of those who don't choose that lifestyle. My question really is J.D. Vance another Donald Trump? Do they share the same mental pathology in any way?
I would say at this point he does, because he would be an example of what I've been calling shared psychosis. Now, it sounds quite severe, but it simply means that the primary individual with the symptoms will have transmitted their symptoms to a secondary individual, to the point where the two would be indistinguishable. I say this especially because J.D. Vance has made a transformation since his followership of Donald Trump. He's seen the rise of Trump. In the beginning, he was critical of him, and then he made this 180-degree turnaround that many people have observed, and others as well, such as Senator Lindsey Graham, Rudolph Giuliani, Alan Dershowitz. There are many individuals who seem to almost do a 180-degree turnaround. Of course, they may have had predilections in the first place, but the transformation that is often seen beyond rational explanation, beyond even cynical political calculation, is often as a result of spread of symptoms. And we've seen that a great deal with Donald Trump. There are now about 4 or 5 categories of people: those who in shared psychosis, those who have the same symptoms as the afflicted leader, also can find synergy, so that's included in shared psychosis. There are those who are predisposed through their personality structure or other means, whose symptoms can be brought up by the exposure to an impaired leader. The third type is the normal person, who then adopts the symptoms of the impaired leader. So normal persons are not immune. They may be later in being induced into the shared psychosis, but they can be afflicted. And then there's a fourth category of people who resist for a very long time, but then succumb. And those are the hardest people to turn around, because the dramatic thing about shared psychosis, which I've seen a great deal because I've worked in prison settings with street gangs, with violent offenders, and also schizophrenic patients in state hospitals. What's remarkable is that when they're in close proximity with people, or they have constant exposure, it's not the healthy individuals who turn the impaired person around in the absence of intervention, but rather the sick individual who spreads their symptoms over time. So unless there's treatment, this is a natural progression that the symptoms would spread, and quite dramatically, because if there's a schizophrenic member in the family and they're dominant, the rest of the family, no matter how healthy they were to start, they would eventually succumb to even bizarre beliefs and delusions. I've seen a dramatic case such as that near Boston, and we hospitalized. First you have to take a very careful history to figure out who the primary individual is, because they all look like they have the syndrome. But once you figure out who the primary individual was, the one who first had the illness, who's actually the only one with the illness, who first had the symptoms, that's the only person you need to hospitalize. And once they're separated from the rest of the family returns to their baseline state. It's quite a dramatic observation.
So what needs to happen to Donald Trump for half of the voting public to return to their baseline state? Does he need to be, because if he's criminalized and incarcerated, there is the concept of martyrdom, which will make people even more excited about him. Does he need to die? I mean, I don't quite understand how we fix this particular problem.
Well, the way he tries to prevent his prosecution and incarceration is that he says he will become a martyr, and there will be riots in the streets. People will see more violence than if he were allowed to return to the presidency. That's what he's trying to propagate people to believe. But that's actually untrue. Indeed, if we were to incarcerate him and remove him from public exposure, from my clinical experience, what happens is that his influence will wane quite dramatically, more dramatically than we imagine, because right now his influence is so great, we can't imagine that it
so
would
you're cutting
diminish.
off the food supply, effectively.
That's right.
The food supply to the nation is taken away.
Yes.
And you would need to make sure that he didn't have access to social media in prison, and that there was, a definitive line in the sand. So the media have really failed us here, haven't they? Because the media is falling for his tactic where they're going along the lines of, him saying, well, if anything happens to me, there'll be a third world war, there'll be a civil war, I think he said.
I mean, there will inevitably be violence because of his stoking of it and his creating a culture of violence. But it will not be to the degree that he threatens. And you are correct in that the media, the population, the entire nation has been misled into believing his rhetoric, because there have not been mental health experts to explain the severity and the seriousness of his symptoms and the appropriate interventions. That is why we felt it so necessary to come out to the public and educate the public at the same time as hold our conferences and consultations with Congress members when they invited us. Congress members, in fact, were depending on us to educate the public medically so that they could intervene politically. This is what they told us. And at the time, it astonished me that they would depend on us. But it was correct that their interventions would depend on the appropriate interpretation of the situation based on expertise. And we would have the tools and the principles of how to intervene, what political means would be effective. Of course, psychiatrists and mental health experts shouldn't be doing the political interventions, but we should be advising those who do. And indeed, we had the best available knowledge in the area that was the defining feature of the Trump presidency, that is mental health, and continues to be, even in this campaign.
But the political interventions failed. The two impeachments failed because they weren't ratified or criminalized in the Senate. And all of those guardrails that we've been talking about for decades seems to just disappear in the moment. That really was because of the cult-like mentality of the Republican senators who felt that it was more healthy for them as a political movement to protect their leader than to do the right thing by society.
But again, it's not entirely rational. It's at times self-destructive because of Trump contagion, or what I've called Trump contagion, the emotional contagion of unhealthy symptoms and ways of thinking and behaving. without the intervention of the American Psychiatric Association and the New York Times, which happened when we were the number one topic of national conversation, and I was invited to speak on all the major news programs and interviewing for 15 hours a day, they intervened and blacked us out of the media. That was when I warned that if we did not intervene in the appropriate way through mental health principles, even if the interventions themselves were political, they had to be informed by mental health principles. That's why we were consulted for the 25th Amendment by the Congress, which had the power to form an other body that would be able to remove a president. And the two impeachments we had, once for the first impeachment, we had a letter signed to the Speaker Nancy Pelosi by 900 mental health professionals urging her to consult with us because it was so critical that she take our psychological analysis into consideration so that he does not turn this into an advantage for him, that he would be a scapegoat or a victim. And also so that regardless of what the Senate did, it could carry weight with the public. There were many means of doing this, but it was not possible because once we were blacked out of the media, Congress could also no longer consult with us.
I suppose the January 6th commission and committee did what you're describing. Is it actually communicated directly with the public by nature of it being televised, and then that all of that intel and that data formed part of Jack Smith's prosecution.
That's right.
So from that perspective, it is very helpful to sometimes circumnavigate the political elements of this. And
that's right.
Because we shouldn't,
especially when mental health issues are involved, because it's the debilitating factor that does not allow the political process to work.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the political process doesn't really work here. And I think a lot of people who are institutionalized, I am not because I'm like a newbie, but for those who are institutionalized into a system of an electoral college that is entirely unnatural and to a system of government where there are supposed checks and balances, all of which seem to have failed with Donald Trump, because it's been a decade now, Dr. Lee, of his voice, his rhetoric, his lies, his abuse and his incitement of violence and extortion, as with that first impeachment. It's remarkable to me that somebody can be allowed to travel so far down this road to disaster, and yet there isn't a kind of collective body that goes, something, it's enough already.
And you may have noticed that even as his symptoms grow more severe,
yes,
his followership only grows to the point where African Americans, Latino Americans, he's gathered an even greater percentage of supporters from them, despite the fact that they have been so devastated by his COVID-19 mismanagement, as well as his racist policies. And yet, we see that the followership has actually grown. This can only be explained by mental health means. So not counting that area or pretending that it doesn't exist does not help us to resolve it.
Okay, we have to take another quick break. I want to come back and continue that particular conversation. And I also want to discuss his behavior at the Arlington National Cemetery. Yes. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you a tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does. Optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. So, if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/weekend to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/weekend for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. Welcome back to the Weekend Show with Dr. Bandy Lee. There's a few things to kind of discuss from this week. Arlington National Cemetery is a sacred place. It is where veterans are buried. It is where people and families see this burial ground as somewhere that is not to be used for political purposes. And in fact, there are kind of written or unwritten rules to suggest this. Well, Donald Trump put all that to one side and effectively used it as a platform to electioneer a photo op, and he has denied exploiting this visit to the soldiers' graves and using it for political purposes. The words he used were, "I don't need the publicity," he said. And the photograph, which has ricocheted around the world, is of him standing at these three gravestones with the thumb up, the typical Donald Trump happy face, thumbs up. And this is standing with family members. 13 U.S. servicemen and women were killed in a suicide bombing as the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021. And this is how he chooses to commemorate it. Let's just take this in two parts, because I want to talk about how the families were coerced into wanting to take part in this and stand with him and be photographed with the thumbs up. But maybe we should first talk about his opinion of veterans, especially those who've lost their lives in battle. He's never had a high opinion of people that die in the line of duty, has he?
Well, according to one of the insiders, he has called them losers and suckers.
Yeah.
He himself is highly averse to any exposure of his own weakness. And the way that he expresses that is through disdain of those showing any kind of weakness, including having died, the natural consequence of, for a good proportion of those who try to defend the nation. And he's constantly disparaged John McCain. He's disparaged disabled veterans. He would never wish to see himself in alignment with anyone who might have experienced any kind of human frailty or signal to him as human frailty, because that's all he sees. He doesn't see the heroism, the sacrifice, and the upholding of principles, nation, the freedom to the point of wishing to give one's life in order to guard those things. He can't understand any of that. He, most people would have noticed he can only think of himself. And even the use of the cemetery he's only there because the nation celebrates the veterans, and it's the adulation that he's after. And he's also targeting Joe Biden by attributing to him the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, when it was, in fact, that's another example where he set up the failure of the withdrawal. And in fact, when Biden was going along with his schedule that was determined without any preparation, based on a Camp David meeting with the Taliban, which was untrustworthy, that he would, in fact, help Donald Trump's portrayal of himself and as having planned this successfully, but it was Biden who failed in its execution, whereas in fact he is the one who created that situation. So there's nothing other than for political reasons that he was there. If not take photographs and footages, there would be no reason for him to be there. He would not go there that's the last place where he would go if it were not publicized. And so for that to happen, and for those who are trying to enforce the rules of the cemetery in order to preserve its sanctity, where of course they were pushed aside, they were physically pushed around and disparaged and psychologically attacked as being mentally unwell. So that's, of course, almost unthinkable for anyone of any position, let alone a former president. But that's exactly why we've been warning that he is so dangerous and so unfit. And it's truly his unfitness that is causing him to continue to gain momentum, because he has not been stopped.
Let's talk about the families who were in the photograph with him. I've tried to analyze this myself, and I can only assume that Donald Trump, for some voters, comes with an aspect of celebrity. And to have your photograph taken with a celebrity is a classic thing, and that's fine. The weirdness comes when it's actually in the cemetery, amongst the gravestones, on that day, and in that moment. How do you think he was able to persuade these families to kind of pose in this way? And do you think that they did put their emotions to one side in order to satisfy the great Donald Trump, or is there some other force at play?
Well, he has dangerous personality features that are very convincing, beguiling, manipulative, and deceptive in ways that people can get carried away and very easily become his patrons and pawns, as we call them. He would be a master manipulator who creates patrons of those who can support him and pawns of those who can become his instruments. So there was one family who agreed that they even publicly stated that they gave him permission to appear with them that way. But there were other families who objected and made clear they did not give their consent. But we can expect a large proportion to be led into something that they otherwise would not have agreed to. We
see that a lot, though, don't we? Where people get caught up in the whirlwind of Trump and find themselves either doing things, being coerced to do things that they never intended to do, or, as you said earlier regarding J.D. Vance, have a total turnaround and are so, their minds are so penetrated by him that they can have a complete 360 on their opinion of him and even become supporters.
And it's not a rational, informed process. It's highly emotional and unconscious.
I mean, it's so interesting to talk about the human condition in a level of detail that the media does not have time for. And then that is something that, has always frustrated me. And I might actually mention in this moment, and I'd never like to disparage newscasters or people in the business, but the CNN interview that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz did a few days ago was very interesting. It was super hyped that it was going to be something special. And yet the interviewer failed to kind of capture the moment or talk about the emotion and the changing nature of the campaign, just talking about the movement and the sense of feeling in the country and a sense of hope, and instead just did some kind of gotcha Republican talking point questions, which was very disappointing because it's such a lazy way to communicate. And I'm not saying that because I'm a supporter of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. I'm saying that because it is important to go beneath the surface. And the feeling that we are experiencing in America right now, courtesy of this change of candidate, is
Yes.
It's emotional. It's a mental health issue, as opposed to it's something you can't really talk about in linear terms. You have to have a deeper, more thoughtful conversation about.
Well, there's an underlying process that we haven't discussed. Why are people so exuberant and so relieved and
Yes.
so refreshed to be in this rational realm where the baggage of Donald Trump's projections, manipulations, all that he lays on his opponents, which is actually his own attributes, do not exist because we have a fresh candidate. And why did her and Walz's word weird catch on like wildfire? Because for the first time, they were acknowledging that Donald Trump was not mentally normal.
Yes.
Whereas all the news and major media have been portraying this as a
so
normal
is
race.
Weird a nicer word or a more accessible word to describe insanity? Because it seems that if you've spoken about his insanity on a clinical level, people don't really have the head for that. The media certainly
Right.
doesn't. But maybe
because of
Weird
the
is a conduit.
Because of the absence of mental health education all these years. That is why we felt that informing the public was our primary responsibility when a mental health issue became a crisis, a national emergency, which was at the start of his presidency.
Mm-hmm.
And we've allowed this to simply continue. And it came with the removal of mental health experts from the major media, which the American Psychiatric Association did in order to protect its federal funding, which it got windfalls of under the Trump administration.
It was a bribe, effectively.
Right. It had nothing to do with scientific data, the standards of the field. In fact, we are legally obligated to speak if there's a danger to the public for mental health reasons. And we have a societal responsibility as well as a responsibility to our patients. So we've decided that this met the threshold. The most renowned psychiatrists and psychologists in mental health had decided that this met the threshold of our speaking up and warning the public, informing, educating, warning, and protecting the public are all our societal duties. But we were not able to meet those duties because not by choice. I mean, thousands of us wished to speak publicly. That's why we gathered in my organization, the World Mental Health Coalition. That's why we published our books. And yet the public did not have privy to this critical information and base knowledge that we had to offer them to be able to protect themselves. Knowledge is indeed power in this situation. And so we're still at the level where weird is where people can understand. And
which is fine, though, isn't it? I mean, in this moment, I suppose that if weird is going to be the word that gives people access to a third dimension that has been ignored by the media, then that's good enough, because some people will say, well, why is he weird? And then will want to know what causes the weird. And then maybe they will end up doing a deeper dive into the mental health aspects of it. And so I'm kind of happy with the weird word. I think it works.
It's a beginning. Now. It's an entry point. But of course,
yes.
It's far from sufficient. You have a patient who needs major surgery and you're giving them a Band-Aid because a Band-Aid is familiar to the public.
Yes.
That is why we are organizing the major all-day conference at the National Press Club, bringing together experts of all different fields, top experts of different areas that would attest to the importance of fitness and leadership, and the mental health experts who can explain how mental fitness works, what is necessary for us to be able to distinguish that and achieve that, what to do in this election, where election alone will not take care of the mental health problem, as it did not in 2020. Of course, it's the most critical means we have available, but it's not sufficient.
But in media terms, it requires time. And, whilst documentaries have been made quite successfully about this topic, in terms of the churn of rolling news, that they simply don't have the time to have these types of conversations. And that's why I suppose I was disappointed in the CNN interview, because it had been built up as something, and I was hoping that they might go deeper, not just talking about Donald Trump's deficiencies and danger and potential, violent rhetoric, but also to talk about the positivity and the energy that has come with this campaign. And they failed on both counts.
How can we heal ourselves from this situation? That's what the public is constantly asking about. But the solutions have not come from the media, and the media have only served as conduits for Donald Trump's symptoms and made things worse. So there's a lot to undo, as well as to progress and do in the task of meeting this, what I've been calling mental health pandemic. The public has been far more advanced in recognizing the problem and recognizing the need for expertise. Their desire for expertise has been continuous and powerful throughout. But in terms of the responses we've been getting on our website, people who have contacted me over the years, it's the mainstream media that have not been responding. Actually, there was an article in the New York Times, which was, someone called it a humor piece, but it was titled, "Donald Trump Can Win by Character."
Yes, I saw that. Yeah. Scary.
It's frightening.
I want to talk finally, because we have to finish in a minute, but I want to talk finally about the stakes in this November election. People recognizing how high the stakes are. Freedom, fascism, democracy, dictatorship. Very clear lines as I see it. What we require is for people who have traditionally voted Republican just this once to vote for the Democratic candidate. They don't have to become Democrats. They don't have to change their allegiance. They don't have to re-register. They just need to vote on voting day for the candidate that is, to all intents and purposes, somebody who is a normal candidate, not an abnormal candidate, who's somebody who advocates for democracy and the business as usual, rather than this weird dystopian Project 2025 plan for America. Do you think that people have it in them to, on this occasion, knowing how high the stakes are, and maybe not even to tell anyone, because I think that often plays a part, doesn't it? The voting booth is a very private space. Do you think people recognize the stakes, and will they put their checkmark in Kamala Harris's box because, despite their historical allegiances, because they know how important it is?
I don't think it'll come as much from the recognition of how important it is. Certainly that'll be a factor. But those who have that capacity are already voting for Kamala Harris. what will make a difference is to reach out from a more emotional standpoint, because it really is not a rational process we're speaking of. We're speaking of extending a human hand to the other side to say, we will accept you if you choose to vote on our side. We will not attack you. We will, you will have a place with us. And consider our side. You don't have to suffer the way you have by an oppressive, abusive ruler who will only use you and discard you when you no longer become useful to him.
That is the sad part of this story. I think I've said that before regarding this moment that you remind us of, is that Donald Trump cares only for Donald Trump. And despite all of these, announcements, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, it never comes down to that at the end of the day. He is a confidence trickster who is tricking people to vote for him to save his own skin. And the opposite could not be more true for Kamala Harris, who is a lifelong public servant.
Mental health is always life-affirming, regardless of ideology. And pathology is the opposite. It eventually brings destruction and death, even to those who believe that they are serving themselves.
Okay, well, we have to finish, but Dr. Bandy Lee, thank you so much again for joining the weekend show.
Thank you again for having me.
And I should remind people to visit bandylee.com and to take a look at the details of this all-day dangerous case of Donald Trump leadership fitness conference in Washington, D.C. that Dr. Lee is organizing and help support that cause as well. Let's do this again next week. I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. You can see more of me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, and we'll come back next Sunday and discuss the ongoing dangerous case of Donald Trump with Dr. Bandy Lee on the 5 Minute News weekend show with Midas Touch.